Welcome everyone back to weekly weather updates, and in today's video and have the latest from the live radar, run for the latest UKV, have a look at the precipitation and the temperature over the next 5 days as we are continuing to stay fairly unsettled and fairly mild over the next 4 or 5 days. But right towards the end of that day 5, we are starting to see some of that colder air that we've been predicting for a while now starting to creep in for parts of Scotland. Now it's going to take its time to head further southwards, and some runs still aren't getting all of that cold air right down towards southern England, but a lot now are, and that number that bring quite widespread cold into the latter third of November continues to increase today, as we'll see from the longer range charts. All runs now are showing a big Greenland and Icelandic block developing into the second half of the month, gradually pushing cold Arctic air our way. Now, because it is only late autumn, we haven't got a massive abundant pool of cold air just to our north or northeast. So it's going to take its time, and it's not going to be as potent as if this happened in January, for example. But the majority of runs do push north or northeasterly winds in. All the runs today do develop a colder spell, so some with sort of different severities, different kind of time frames, but all do get there, especially for northern areas, and both the GFS and the eastern BF even get cold and potentially wintry conditions even further southwards towards the final week to 10 days of the month. So a very interesting update once again today. Confidence increasing in this colder pattern into the final third of the month, and it does look like we are going to be seeing a bit of early wintriness through the rest of November. So do remember, if you enjoy videos, make sure you like and subscribe. Now, if you start on the live radar, not too much going on today. Recording this around 2 p.m. on Saturday afternoon. You can see at the moment we have got some showers around for Scotland, and we've got some more persistent rain pushing in for parts of the Republic of Ireland. But all of this precipitation is going to peter out as it progresses further eastwards as a result of higher pressure slowly building in. Now, the high pressure is extending and kind of skipping past the UK all the way up towards Greenland. So we aren't going to see a massive settling down period over the next few days. But what we are going to see is these precipitation bands not going to be quite as intense as they look initially as they approach off the Atlantic. And that's exactly what we've got going on at the moment. There's a few showers elsewhere, but generally it's a fairly mild and dry day. You can see lots of yellows around, no reminiscence of anything cold or wintry at all. We're still a good few degrees above average this afternoon, mid-teens. It's going to take, a big colder push to get those temperatures down. But that looks likely to arrive, especially for northern areas, into next week. Now, if you look at the latest UKV, you can see a few bits and bobs of showers around at the moment. More persistent rain is going to try and push in from the east, and it's going to make progress, but you can see it does fizzle away as it progresses further and further inland. And we're going to see some more heavier rain further southwards there into Sunday. As a result of that high pressure nudging northwards, it is going to push the jet stream slowly southwards, and that's why these precipitation bands are slowly nudging southwards as well. And that's why the main focus for rain is going to be across more England and Wales there into Monday, and you can see that continues into Monday evening and Tuesday, and we're going to see some more widespread rainfall pushing northwards during Tuesday. But you can see the lows are further southerly tracked as a result of this higher pressure further northwards. And look what slowly happens to these precipitation bands. They don't clear to the north of Scotland, and that's because they're not getting allowed to push that much further northwards as a result of the high pressure block that is building in. And eventually, towards the end of this run, the precipitation starts to meet colder air, and we start to see the first signs of some wintriness over northern Scotland, over the higher ground of Scotland there. So not getting widespread cold yet at the end of this UKV run, but we're starting to see that air pushing in, and you can see that here from the 850 HPA temperatures. You can see chillier areas to our north through Tuesday, very mild further southwards still, but slowly Wednesday into Thursday, you can see that colder air just to the north of the British Isles starts to nudge southwards, making more and more progress. And you can see by the earliest hours of Thursday, the -5 isotherms just about nudging in, and much colder, -7, -8, maybe even -10 is not too far away to our north. As I said, it is still November, so it's unlikely we see anything too deep in terms of cold. We're not going to see a little widespread -10 isotherm or anything like the -15 isotherm, which can, if we do get a proper Arctic push, arrive in these sort of patterns. It's unlikely we're going to see anything like that just because of the time of year. But we can still see very cold air, cold enough to bring some winteriness, especially further northwards, and cold enough to bring well below average temperatures pretty much everywhere. And we're starting to see the glimmers here on the latest UKV. Now, if you look at max temperatures, you can see into Saturday, still very mild, 13 or 14 degrees. Into Sunday, it's a similar story, 13, 14 once again, no signs of anything cold. Monday, starting to turn a little bit chillier further northwards, but this is just generally overnight temperatures dropping away as a result of clearer skies, not anything too cold yet. As you can see, the afternoon, more around the mid to high single digits, which is close to average for those northern areas, so nothing too remarkable yet. But Monday, further southwards, still 12, 13, maybe 14. Into Tuesday, a few frosts starting to develop across Scotland, so it's a gradual cool down, and by the afternoon, struggling more around the mid to low single digits for some of the higher ground of Scotland, still low to mid-teens further southwards. And then slowly into Wednesday, colder once again for Scotland, maybe only 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees in places, still 14 degrees further southwards. And then into the early hours of Thursday, temperatures are really quite cold overnight, coinciding with that precipitation, and starting to see glimmers of that Arctic air and some winteriness. Another big telltale sign of that colder air is the dew points. This gives us a real indication of what sort of air masses we've got. Atlantic, moist, warm air masses, or mild air masses, let's just say. We're looking at dew points in the double digits. Look at that, 13, 14 degrees further southwards. Further northwards, though, dew points closer to freezing, if not below freezing, symbolic of a very dry, cold, Arctic air mass. And remember, to see winteriness, we need those dew points at freezing or preferably below freezing. And that's what we're starting to see nudging in for Scotland. So UKV already starting to get that cold air pushing in for Scotland. But I must stress, for it to push further southwards, most runs do take it at least another few days until that could push in. So still, if you are in England or Wales, for example, colder air probably not going to arrive, if the runs are correct, for another 7 or 8 days at least. Further northwards, you can start to see the first hints arrive in 5 days, potentially consolidating in the next kind of 6 or 7. And we can see that now on the latest GFS. So you can see the high pressure is starting to extend up towards Greenland, and you see it's further eastwards, it's more dominant, and that's why these weather fronts are starting to come up against a bit of a brick wall as they push in. But eventually that high is going to kind of skip over the top of us, head straight towards Greenland. It's initially quite weak, but you can see it is building in. Now, you can see why it's still remaining fairly mild is because this low is not clearing to the east, and this is something we focused on yesterday. Is this low going to clear to the east? Because at the moment, we've got a big block. We've got a very cold synoptic pattern, typically a cold block here. But because of the positioning of this low, it's actually pulling in a south to southwesterly wind. But if we follow the subsequent days, you can see northerly winds start to arrive for Scotland. Further southwards, not so much. And what we get here is a bit of a different, a big contrast across the British Isles. Cold, very cold Arctic air starting to stream for Scotland, very mild air streaming in for southern parts. And it's what wins out. Where does this low go? Now, a lot of runs had been showing a bit of a battleground, and that still continues on some runs, but the GFS definitely has the cold air eventually winning. As I said, it takes its time. The -5 isotherm cold air was in for Scotland here. It's been in from pretty much day 5, like the UKV was showing. But around day 7, day 8, this low eventually clears into Europe, and we slowly see very cold air moving in for all. So it's around day 8, day 9, once very cold air does push in for all. And then you can see we are opening the door to very cold northeasterly winds. As I said, it is still November, so you can see the abundance of cold air to our north isn't really there. If we were in mid-December, mid-January, or in that portion, we'd be looking at the -20, -25, -30 degree isotherm well to our north, and we'd be feeding in air masses off that. We'd never see those sort of air masses, but we'd be feeding air from that. Whereas you can see here, we've got a cold pool, but it's nothing massive. It's still only late autumn. But regardless, cold air is in play, and you can see it streams in from the north or northeast. There are low pressure systems that do bump into the cold air, so there is the risk of snow. Now, not necessarily going to see widespread accumulating snow, because remember, the ground is still very mild, very warm. We've had a very mild November so far, so it is going to take a long time for the ground to cool down, for the air mass at the surface to cool down, of course, as well. When the -5 isotherm pushes in, it's not going to instantly drop to 2 or 3 degrees. It's going to take a while for that air at the surface to really cool down, as this is the first real potent cold spell of the winter. So don't expect it to go from 18 degrees or 17 degrees like we saw a couple of days ago to suddenly 2 or 3 degrees. It's not going to happen like that. It is going to be a slow transition, but if this air masses stick around like this, GFS run is showing, then that definitely looks like a possibility. And you can see by the end of the run, looks very cold, and then we can eventually see low pressure trying to approach from the Atlantic once again. It does win out initially, but we've got a really complex pattern developing here. Another big battleground scenario going on. Regardless though, it's very cold, a typical cold northeasterly wind developing here. Again, if we zoom into the surface, you can see temperatures by day are looking at 3 or 4 degrees at best. So yeah, not mild at all, maybe 5 or 6 in some spots, and overnight dropping close to freezing. So it's a very cold pattern. And again, we'll have to look at the details nearer the time. But yeah, definitely would be very cold for late November. And it's not only just a brief northerly or northeasterly wind, it's looking pretty persistent. It's not going to just be 2 or 3 days. If this does develop, it looks like it could be a good 5 to 7 days, maybe even up to 10 days. And even once it breaks down, which it will, inevitably will, given the longer term signal we've got, I wouldn't be surprised to see this sort of pattern reoccurring as we progress later on in November, and especially into December. And if this pattern does develop and continue to develop into December, then it would get more and more potent, more and more widespread, and open the door to more possibilities of actually disruptive colder weather, because those air masses, as I said, to our northeast would be that much colder if we give it another 2, 3, 4 weeks to cool down. So yeah, could be a lot of wintry and cold conditions on the horizon. This could just be the appetizer for the early portion of winter, and especially with what some of the longer term predictions do show, with this sort of environment continuing throughout December, maybe into January as well. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see, but definitely GFS once again today very much on board with cold air, widely in the north, definitely further southwards at times, and a really potent early season colder spell. Now, the GM has been more sceptical, more up and down over the coming days, and today it's a little bit in between with its run. It's very similar with the high pressure building up towards Greenland, low pressure coming in off the Atlantic, but you see that battle between the low to the south and the west and the cold air to our northeast takes its time, and it never really pushes cold air in for all further southwards. We see cold air initially pushing in, but it really struggles up against the low pressure system and that milder air. Eventually, by the end of the run, we get a really mixed pattern. We've got incredibly mild air across southern areas, incredibly cold air across northern areas, and this is the sort of scenario where we'd see heavy snow, widespread wintriness, and very cold conditions for Scotland, wet, windy, and mild further southwards. And you can see that if we zoom in at these surface temperatures, you can see 12 or 13 degrees there. Overnight in London, -6 there across central Scotland overnight for the second half of November. So GM does get a cold pattern developing, but it's a northern sort of colder spell that does develop, and because of all the moisture further southwards, it could be really disruptive for Scotland, this sort of scenario, with all this precipitation pushing northwards into that cold air. I wouldn't be surprised to see quite significant snow developing already here, quite a lot of snow depth. Again, I wouldn't take these too reliably because they are such longer range predictions, but it just kind of shows heavy snow could be a real possibility. Now, the ECMWF, to be honest, is a bit of a pick of a bunch run today. It is not only very cold, it's very persistent, and it is widespread. GFS eventually gets to more of a widespread colder spell, but ECMWF really goes to town with it. You can see it's the same pattern. Northerly's trying to push in into the middle of next week. Southwesterly's still pushing in initially, but ECMWF continues with that low just to our south, but eventually it peels it away. The high becomes a little bit closer to us, which actually prevents any Atlantic breaking through. So it does delay it a little bit, doesn't come in as quickly as the GFS, but once the cold air pushes in here around the end of its run, my gosh, it is cold and widespread. Look at this, huge, far-fetched northeasterly wind straight from eastern portions of Europe up towards the Arctic there. And you can see it is very cold. -5 isotherm in for all, -10 isotherm flirting. And you can see the temperatures by day, once again, low single digits and overnight towards freezing. It's a very cold pattern. And it's more of a typical northeasterly wind, which can be colder and more potent. So you can see early on in its run, it takes its time to get cold air in. Cold air initially pushes in for Scotland, but takes its time, really struggles. But towards day 10, we eventually see the very cold air pushing in. And it's dominant northeasterly by the end of its run. So all three runs grabbing something cold and wintry within their outlooks. GFS, widespread, and does it fairly quickly. GEM is northern areas, but could be very disruptive given the moisture that we're pushing in from the south. Eastern left takes its time, but eventually gets there with pretty widespread northeasterly winds by the end of its run. So still some disagreement on the exact severity, timings, and widespread nature of the colder pattern, but all three runs once again today do produce cold and wintry conditions, at least for some, for a significant period of time, and all indicate the risk of disruption with this. It doesn't look like it's going to be one of these cold 2 or 3 day northerly winds, a few wintry showers. It's not going to be something like that. This does look like something more and could be something definitely disruptive depending on the exact outlook. Not only are the operational runs continuing with this pattern, but the ensembles continue to push towards a colder solution. Still very mild for London here for the next week. As I said, not expecting anything cold further southwards for the next week. Around the 15th, 16th, you start to see those runs dropping off. And there's a lot now that's below freezing, a lot towards the -5. And interestingly, there's 4 or 5 that get close to the -10. And if that did push in the -10 this time of year, it wouldn't matter that it's late autumn. It would be very cold. It would have the risk of widespread snow. Pretty much the -10 isotherm. Yeah, you see widespread snow anywhere with the -10 isotherm pushing in. So very low risk of that, but a few ensemble members hinting at that. You see the GFS run, which as I said was cold, pretty potent, pretty widespread. It's kind of in the middle of all of those colder runs, so it's not an outlier by any means. It's definitely below the ensemble mean, but by no means is it by itself out there. Like sometimes we do see the GFS operation run going by itself. Here it's not. It has got a lot of support. There are still quite a few milder runs, but definitely we're slowly seeing more and more creeping to that colder perspective. You can see the big thing is sea level pressure slowly rising longer term. That's indicative of that big block, especially if it becomes closer to us. It prevents the Atlantic potentially breaking through with those lows from the southwest, and that would produce more widespread colder conditions. Dew points, again, big indicator as we saw from the UKV. Double digits for next week, then dropping off, and most runs low single digits, if not below freezing there. You can see not as many get below freezing, which indicates widespread wintriness for low-lying areas in the south, like London, are going to be difficult this time of year. Not guaranteed. A possibility. There are still plenty below freezing, but not too many. So it's always going to be a bit more marginal. So do take that into account. When we say cold and wintry, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to see a foot of snow. It just means that the risk of wintry hazards is going to be there. It looks definitely for northern areas and especially Scotland, but the risk is there for southern areas. At times, overnight, maybe a few rogue hefty showers can cause some disruption. That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a foot of snow at this stage, at least. Disruption definitely possible, and it's one we'll keep a close eye on. 2 meter temperatures are going to drop off massively. Look at that drop, even with some of the milder runs within this ensemble outlook. We're going from 14, 15 degrees middle of next week to 7 or 8 maybe into the second half or final third of November. And that again takes into account the milder runs. If we ignore the milder runs and go all with the colder runs, then we're looking at 4 or 5 degrees. As I said, because it is late November, we've got a legacy of warmth from the summer and a very mild autumn so far. We're unlikely to see big ice days, especially further southwards, but without seeing an exceptionally cold air mass moving in, just because it is still mid to late November. I said though, if these patterns recur, late November, early December, then we could start to see ice days creeping in. So we're not looking at, as I said, below freezing days here. Below freezing overnight, definitely possible further southwards. And by day, definitely well below average, maybe 4 or 5 degrees at best. Glasgow, though, if we look, you can see much closer to that ice day territory. Lots of runs here, 2 to 4 degrees at overnight below freezing. And you can see if we look at the new snow depth, there's quite a few spikes here. Nothing ridiculous at this stage. It's still longer range, but definitely quite a big chunk of runs starting to show that widespread cold. And if we finish by looking at the EC and OF ensembles, pretty confident as well. Maybe not as much as the GFS, especially with the timings. The drop-off around the 15th to 16th, a little bit more delayed. So again, all depends on that evolution of that low later on next week. But all runs get, or most runs, let's say, get there eventually, like the operational run does. So continue pretty high confidence that we are going to see something much colder as we progress into the second half of November. The details, how widespread it's going to be, and severity are still a little bit up in the air. But yeah, definitely looks fairly confident. No massive wobbles yet. We'll probably see one at some point. But yeah, continual confidence that we are going to see some wintry and cold conditions later on through November. As I said, could be really quite potent for those northern areas if some of the runs are to be believed. And yeah, don't rule out the south either. If we saw something like the East Indo-F or maybe the GFS, then yeah, definitely looks like the possibility is there. I've had a look at the precipitation charts. Not going to show them as, they are going to definitely over-dramatise wintriness. But GFS and East Indo-F do show snow later on of their runs, even into parts of England and Wales. So don't rule it out. We'll have to wait and see. But still medium to longer range at this stage. So still a lot that could change. So anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. And I'll see you again for another video soon.